All right, back to Joshua, and to answer the question concerning the land promises of the Abrahamic covenant. And as we discuss that, I want to point you to a discussion in David Howard's commentary in the NAC series, where he has gone through and looked both in first of all the Torah, and then particularly here in the book of Joshua, he's taken a look at the roots to give, a ton. And he brings a summary of his findings in these two paragraphs. And I would base our discussion and our summarization based upon his summary of the verb to give. He says that as you take a look at the verb in Joshua, it reveals several things. Four to be exact. First, the land of Canaan was God's gift to his people Israel. He alone was the giver. And that goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, 12:7, 15, where again and again, God says, as you go through the book of Genesis, to Abraham, to your seed, I will give this land. And so the land was God's gift to his people Israel as the seed of Abraham. Second, God gave the land's peoples into Israel's hands as well. So not only he had given the land, he has also given the people. They were not taking just the land on their own or through their own strength or their own merits. It's the fact that God was dealing with the people there. As we've already said, he was dispossessing them and giving possession to the nation of Israel. And so he also uses the verb to say, I'm giving the peoples into your hands as well. Third, God was doing this in Joshua's day in fulfillment of the many promises he has made to do so. To the patriarchs, to Moses, and to the earlier generations of Israel. Deuteronomy 1, 7, and 8. The land was set before them. Go in and take possession because I have given it to you. And yet, as the verb was used, and here's the key. Fourth, the giving of the land, says Howard, as you take a look at the verb, was viewed from two distinct perspectives. In one, when the verb was used in the perfect, the land already belongs to Israel. God had already given it to them. That is, as understood by many exegetes before Howard, given them the rights of the title to it. They had title to the land. It was now theirs. But in the other, when the verb is used in the imperfect or participle, the giving was yet to be accomplished. I will give it to you as you go and possess it. So that there was still a sense in the giving that there was land that still awaited to be taken. And Joshua 1:3 is a good indication. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. That for the giving to be complete, in the experiential sense, there was a responsibility on the part of the people to take the land. And what we see in Joshua, and then later on as we go through the rest of the of the former prophets, and as viewed as reality within the latter prophets, is that Israel never took the land. That giving, in the sense that what you take, I have given to you, that giving was never accomplished in the Old Testament. It was always in Joshua either imminent or in process. But it says how it in conclusion in both perspectives, both land as given and land that will be given. God was the giver and the guarantee of the process. In the latter prophets, when we get there, we'll pick this up and say, all right, you fail, but God will not fail. So that even though historically the land promised has never been completely possessed in the future. And this awaits our discussion in 502. That God is going to be faithful and complete the process. And then, of course, that process is based upon his bringing Israel to repentance and to giving them a new heart, indwelling them with the Spirit, bringing them back in the land, and then they will fully in that process take what God has given to them by title, and what is given by title will become reality as far as their experience is concerned. So there is a sense, as Joshua 21 affirms, that there was, in one sense, a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. The title of the land was given. They rested on every side. Not one of the good promises which Yahweh had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. They had title to the land. The land was open before them. And God would continue, if they would be faithful, to make that reality as far as their experience was concerned. But the sad reality that begins to be seen in Joshua and throughout the rest of the former prophets is that historically this did not take place in Israel's experience. Israel failed to completely possess the land. And so the theme that is seen throughout the Torah continues on into the former prophets, as seen here in Joshua. God is completely faithful. It is Israel's unfaithfulness which is seen in light and in response to Yahweh's faithfulness. So certainly when we get to the latter prophets, and we'll talk about it more when we get into Isaiah through the 12, they look ahead to the time when Israel will completely possess the land, when the Abrahamic covenant will certainly come, if I might put it this way, to full and complete fulfillment. So was there a fulfillment? Well, from God's perspective, yes. Was there a complete and total fulfillment from man's perspective? And the answer was no. That still awaits the future. And so this is how we would see the passages in Joshua that and I would commend to you and send you back to Howard's discussion. Now, quickly, since before the break we want to finish Joshua to get into the exciting book of Judges, let's just very quickly take a look at two other interpretations as far as the book of Joshua is concerned. This is both an academic issue, but certainly one that you will face as you deal in preaching Joshua within a pastoral situation. And that is the lie of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. And there's no way around it. Ahab told a lie. If a lie is defined as words not conforming to reality, that is certainly what Rahab did in Joshua chapter 2. Beginning in verse 3, when the the king of Jericho sends word to Rahab saying, "Bring out the men who've come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them, and she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from." But in verse 9, after sending the king away on her ruse, she says to the men, "I know that Yahweh has given you the land." Well, so much for not knowing where they were from. "And the terror of you has fallen upon us, for we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea." In other words, Rahab knew the history and was a fair theologian as far as getting the implication of what this meant about her as a Canaanite, in light of the fact of what God had done to Israel. And now that these people are on the way and all the inhabitants of the land have melted before you, we've heard not only about Egypt, but also about the 2 kings of the Amorites that were just a few months before when this was taking place. Rahab certainly knows a whole lot more. I didn't know where they were from. Well, yes, she did. And when it came about that it was time to shut the gate at dark, the men went out. And I don't know where the men went. Yes, you do. You hid them. What do you mean you don't know where not only where the men were from, but where the men went? I mean, she's lying on both accounts. She knew where they were from and she knew where they were. "Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them." And the author is very quick to say, but she had brought them up on the roof and hidden them in the stalks of the flax, which she laid in order on the roof. "And the men pursued them on the road to the Jordan, to the fords." We've got to say this, she was also a very convincing liar. That the king and his men pursued them. And of course, as soon as the men went out, they shut the gate. That goes back to, chapter 5, verse 1. They're shut in because they're very afraid of what is going to take place once Israel comes into the land. So, and Rahab says that. So, even though Wustra, and he really doesn't explain this, Rahab's word need not be called a lie. Well, all right, if explicitly the text doesn't say she was lying, that's true, it doesn't. But Wustra doesn't explain his statement any further, so I can't really explicate what he was trying to say at this point. But tell that to your congregation. A major evangelical commentator says that Rahab's words should not necessarily be considered a lie. And you're going to have a lot of people scratching their heads saying, if it wasn't a lie, what was it? Certainly wasn't the truth. So some kind of middle ground there. So that's Wudra's, and I put a question mark, he just makes that statement. He just really doesn't explain it any further. Just, you don't need to take the words to be a lie. Well, for those of us who have a hard time with that exegesis, what are the other positions that have been expounded? And it's not within his history, but in his work on ethics. If you would like position B, Kaiser brings this up in his Toward an Old Testament Ethics. The majority position is that this is historical narrative. It just tells us what happened. That the author is neither really commending nor condemning Rahab's word within this context. And certainly, when this is picked up within the New Testament, we won't take a look. You can read in James chapter 2. Well, let's go there, since this is where it is picked up in the New Testament. What we brought up is that as the New Testament refers back to this historical event, in chapter 2, verse 25 of James, is within the context that a person is justified by works. In other words, their faith is seen by what they did. And one of the ways in which Ahab's faith was seen is what she did. And in the same way, was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works? Her faith was seen in what she did. What did she do? She received the messengers, that is the spies, and sent them out by another way. What other way? The other way from where she had sent the king and the men of Jericho to pursue. All it's saying is look, her faith was seen by what she did. Not necessarily that what she did was right. And then later on, when she asked for deliverance, and the men speak about the scarlet cord, and God honors that when we get to Joshua chapter 6. It was her faith was being commended. Now, as a Canaanite at this point, she did not. She was not a woman of Torah. She didn't know what God had said, concerning the faithfulness of words. She was expressing her faith in this way, and the lie is not condoned either in Joshua 2 or James 2. It's just an evidence of faith, and that is what God was blessing. It's the faith that is to be seen behind her actions that is commended. And as you can see, this is really is the majority position among exegetes, both historically and in a contemporary fashion. But this is not set well with many. Because as you take a look at James chapter 2, they would say, now, all right, James is talking about being justified by being shown righteous, being declared righteous through actions. And he's saying that even though he doesn't talk about the lie that, all right, sent the men away another way, all right, there's nothing within the text that says she repented and said, I should never have told those guys to go that way. But since I did, let me send you the other way so you're not captured. And so is there to be an understanding here, if we might put it this way, that in this situation, the lie in some way was justified and commended. In other words, basically, or not so much commended as condoned. And what B and C are arguing is that in this case, and therefore by application in other cases, a lie might be condoned by God. Kaiser argues what you're dealing with here is that the lie is a lesser sin. That what you see within Scripture, what you see within the Old Testament, is basically a hierarchical aspect that certain sins are more serious and damaging than other sins. Israel certainly recognized that. Sins with a high hand were to be viewed differently, out and out rebellion, as opposed to other sins. In fact, we've already seen in Leviticus that an individual could bring a sin offering for certain sins, but not others. So that there does seem to be an implication of some sins are greater than other sins. And within this context, the king of Jericho and the Jerichites had the greater sin. They were rebelling against the known revelation of Yahweh that Rahab affirms the people of Jericho had. And so here they know of Israel's God Yahweh. They know of his deliverance from Egypt. They know of what has taken place. They know that Israel is going to come in and take the land. And rather than submitting to Yahweh and saying, Yahweh has proven himself by what he has done as the God of heaven and earth. And we know who Israel's God is. And we will submit to him. And very possibly, like Rahab, therefore become a part of and join in the blessings that God gives to Israel. Well, they're basically shown to be rebellious, as the Torah has shown the Canaanites to be. Their iniquity was certainly full. They were in total rejection and rebellion against the true God. And that's the greater sin. And so within this context, the lie, the lesser sin. Now notice it's still called a sin. But at least it is condoned by God within this context of the greater sin. Now what that exegesis forces us to do, even those of us who live in the New Covenant, is to say, well, when God gives certain stipulations from the New Testament epistles, we've got to figure out which is the most important. I mean, all right, no matter what you end up with, in 1 Corinthians 11, certainly, 1 Corinthians chapter 2 talks about, a woman accepting teaching with a submissive attitude, a quiet spirit. Well, as long as that is there, all right, so maybe she will be unsubmissive in some other areas. But that's the lesser sin compared to the greater sin. I mean, and Christians do this all the time. Well, at least my heart was in the right place. I realize that was a sin, but I was really sincere. God knows my heart was not rebellious. That I'm really trying to be, submissive. Or, for some of you that, when it says, well, you shall not steal. Well, that's true. I don't go out and steal, but, I do kind of lie here and there on expense accounts and, IRS forms and things like that. But that's really not as bad as out and out, I want it, I take it, And so a lot of Christians say, I'm really not a thief. Because it's a lesser sin compared to others. A third position, Walke expounds this in, this is Every Man's Bible Commentary, and then Walke in the New Bible Commentary, 4th edition. Deceit is just part of the ethics of war. That once you get, and this is holy war, and in holy war the rules are thrown out. Deception is part of the game, it's part of the battle. In fact, isn't that exactly the strategy that God gives to Joshua in chapter 8 in dealing with Ai? Okay, now you've run, feign the fact that you are retreating again. This will draw the men out. You've got another group behind. They come in, destroy the city. The people, the men see the flames, will lose heart. And doesn't God himself deceive? Well, chapter 7 is not an out-and-out lie. All right, yeah, they're feigning the fact that they are retreating. But that's not the Ahites coming up and saying, are you retreating? Tell me. Yes or no, whether I should chase you or not. It's not an out-and-out lie. It certainly is a strategy and a God-used strategy as far as war is concerned. But to talk about that as being a lie, and certainly the Gibeonites who do tell a lie, are judged because of that in chapter 9. That's still part of the ethics, we might put it this way, of war. We've already talked about Woostra. Davis, excellent commentator, I said on Friday, he just says, well, I don't know whether her words are a lie, but the emphasis of the narrative is on her testimony, on her faith. not her lie. So I think in his words, he really is, although he doesn't explicitly say, going back to A. That understand that it's her faith that is being commended. The lie is not being condoned. He's not bringing in James 2 at this point. He's saying, looking at Joshua chapter 2, this is all the text is saying. This is, a difficult situation. And I don't have the ultimate answer, although I lean toward position A. Knowing that if I was in a situation where my lie might lead to the deliverance of somebody else, and this is always the aspect that is brought up today. Yeah, concentration camps. You're living in a totalitarian system. You're Corrie ten Boom's family that is protecting Jews during World War II, and smuggling Bibles. Do you have any Bibles in your car? Straight face, no. And you will ask everyone, what's your justification? Your justification is that, all right, God does say obey the authorities. But in Acts 5, the apostles said what? We can't obey you because we have to obey God. And it's certainly true, and Kais will point this out with the hierarchical situation, all right, it is very, very true. You are to obey the government authorities, but you're also to obey God. God has given to the church the Great Commission. Go to every creature, preach the gospel. The government says you can't preach the gospel. You can't preach the resurrection. All right? At that point, are you going to be faithful to? And there's not a one of us in this room, I don't believe, at that point would say, all right, if I am commanded not to preach, or I am commanded to hand over someone that I am hiding when the government is doing something that they should not be doing and is trying to, put to death a Jewish person, put to death a Christian who's preaching the gospel, put to death someone because he owns a Bible, etc. At that point, we would basically, no matter what our exegesis is really go to position B. And so we do live in a sinful world. I still lean toward A. That sin on our part is never condoned by God. And though I think all of us, in practical ramifications, really do, more than we think, take position B, a hierarchical approach, be very, very careful. Make sure that what is being commanded, like in this situation, by the king, even if you take position B, really goes against what God has said. Because I think a lot of times we go in a hierarchical approach just because we want to have our sin condoned by God. So it is a tough issue. This is also tied into, to Exodus chapter 1. I told you with the midwives, we'd talk about it more precisely when we got to Joshua chapter 2. Same thing with the midwives. The midwives telling Pharaoh that, hey, we can't stop the birth. You tell us to put the babies to death. We can't. The Hebrew women are more vigorous. By the time we get there, the baby's already born, or it's at least on its way where we can't, step in and put it to death. And yet the text says very clearly they feared God. They were doing this out of fear of God. Whether that was just a ruse for Pharaoh or not, the text doesn't say one way or another. Well, again, God commended their faith, their fear. Did he condone what they were doing or not doing in response to what Pharaoh said. Well, position B would say yes. Position A would say no. God is just commending their faith. He's blessing their faith. And certainly is doing that, although he is not condoning the sin.
Like someone like Rahab didn't know any better about lying per se. Like in her knowledge, she acted.
Well, that's what is brought up. She's not yet a woman of faith. She's a Canaanite. She's just practicing Canaanite ethics at this point. Basically what she's saying is okay, she has faith in Israel's God, but she, at this point, doesn't realize the full implications of what that means as far as her ethical behavior is concerned. Or, even if she is a believer at this point, because many would bring up, well, the deliverance actually takes place in Joshua 6. That's when she's truly delivered. That's when she is saved. Her faith now has worked itself out in the fact that she has done exactly what the spies have said, and God has honored the faith. I'm not so sure, though, that she hasn't already, at least in her heart, had that conversion. I know that Yahweh has given you the land. And that because of that, I want to align with your God. Well, I think that's like a Ruth 1. We'll get back to this too. At that point, I think she is affirming the fact that she has that faith. Now, she doesn't seem to be completely unknowledgeable about Yahweh. Certainly, obviously, yes, at this point she wouldn't know the Torah. But that isn't an argument to try to get, to a certain extent, Rahab off the hook. She is not theologically, ethically reasoning at this point. She is just expressing her faith in the only way she knows how to do it at that point within her experience. All right, so that can help you with all your pre-conversion sins. That application. But again, I'm not so sure because certainly in Exodus 1, the midwives feared Yahweh. Right, that is going a step beyond. Now they are submitting, faithfully submitting to Yahweh. Yahweh is responding, and certainly when you get to Acts chapter 5, these are men who knew very, very well, and still what God expected of them, and yet said at this point, we will not obey you because we've got to obey God, not man. That again is a point that position B, not only from the Old Testament, then from the New Testament, will camp on as well. You probably realize I'm not giving you an answer as much as I'm helping you think through at least what men have said. They believe the answer is you're going to have to, wrestle. And I've gone back and forth between A and B, I'll tell you that. Gentlemen, and it is not an easy issue, and I would certainly commend to you that if you have an opportunity to take Dr. Grassani's class on Old Testament ethics, this is certainly a passage you will go over, and hopefully will help you get. In fact, I'm not sure it's Old Testament. I think it might just be called biblical ethics. But deals with this issue as well as a number of other ethical issues. But certainly, and I would say probably the answer does lie somewhere between A and B. Chad.
Why wouldn't you give more consideration to position C? I'm just curious about your particular reason for not choosing it as far as, justification of war, killing soldiers being justified to kill, which is, on the same level of a lie. Or we do that with this?
Well, no. I think, okay, Old Testament-wise, no. Old Testament-wise, killing in warfare is not viewed as the same as killing with hatred of a personal individual outside of warfare. I think what you can bring up is all right, certainly God allows certain things in war, just as you brought up, the fact that you can go and put enemies to death, that does not take place in peacetime. In other words, you might have an enemy among your people. That doesn't give you the right to go and just take their life. But But certainly the Old Testament doesn't call killing in warfare, particularly for Israel, God-ordained warfare, as sin. I think that's the difference. That, but then other tactics, other things that are used in warfare. Is deceit a part of it? Yes, but it's what's feigned, not what is. Here I've made a statement, okay, and my statement is directly contrary to reality, which is a lie. It is not being reliable in your word. So yeah, you can have actions that in warfare might lead to, well, and what I would say about chapter 8 is that's an interpretation of the men of Ai of what they see taking place. It's not an out-and-out lie. That is part of a stratagem within war. That's permissible. Killing an enemy is permissible in war. And yes, you can go beyond that. I would hold to a just war position. The fact that God gives nations an allowance to, because as you saw in Deuteronomy chapter 2, he was the one who gave these other peoples their lands. And if someone is going to seek to take their land, then they have a right before God to defend their land. He's the one who's given that land to them. And so the whole aspect of a just war. Now, today, ethically, let's face it, let's bring it down again. No newspaper exegesis, but this is an application. Does that also mean preemptive strikes? Does that mean that believing that a nation or entities are seeking to attack us, knowing that we attack them first? Is that part of a just war as well? And my answer is that is a little harder to justify biblically. Does a nation have a right to a first strike? Do they have the right to protect themselves? I think biblically the answer is yes. As a Christian finds themselves within a nation that is called upon to defend itself. Do Christians have a right as Christian citizens or responsibility to take up arms? Even though in taking up arms, they might kill another believer in another army who is also obeying his government in preemptively saying we better get them before they get us. I mean, I'm sure glad God is sovereign over all of this. Although we are called to make these kinds of ethical decisions. So I have no problem if a nation has a just right to war. And as many times brought up, the very last clean war that we had in Western civilization like this was World War II, where clearly there was provocation of an enemy, that sought to take and destroy other nations and bring them under their control. So Christians didn't face the same kind of issues that have now been faced in Korea, Vietnam, and now in the Middle East. John, and that's probably, Steve, I'll take two more. Then we're going to take the break, and I'll leave the microphone on, and we can answer more questions. Having said that, I've got to deal with the other one, too. Well,
my question, just going back to A, and just the definition of faith, does the argument come up that it's just the faith of God, or is it...
It's a faith directed toward God.
So, but in my case, because I was just even thinking in reference to James 2, but it's a faith toward God, not a faith that by doing what God calls you to do, that He will be sovereign in doing that. It's just kind of like, what's
well, you have a hard time because the other illustration that James uses of Abraham offering Isaac, all right, that was certainly a God-ordained test from Genesis chapter 22. In other words, Abraham was obeying and shows. In other words, he has taken God at his word, and God has justified him forensically, to use that New Testament terminology, Genesis chapter 15. But a faith, says James, that God sees is always, going to be shown within actions. That people can't look at the heart, they can only look at what is done. Right? And he's talking about, is a person justified by faith alone? His answer is no. That faith that is part of the person's internal response will have external validation, justified by works. He's not denying forensic justification. He's just saying the person truly justified, like Abraham was, I believe, all the way from taking God's word and going into Canaan, and then taking God's word in chapter 15, taking God's word in chapter 17, the circumcised household, But what James is saying is, now, when did the world see that kind of faith? They saw it when God put it to the test. Faith is tested. That's one of the great principles of the letter of James. Count it all joy when your faith is tested. Because it's when it's tested that it's tried and will be seen for what it is and be rewarded. That God's going to bring tests in your life. Well, within that greater context, all right, here's a test for Rahab. Is she truly responsive to Yahweh? When she has to make a choice between allegiance to Israel and Israel's God, or Jericho and their God, what does her work say? Her faith is seen by her actions toward the king of Jericho and her actions toward the spies or the messengers. And now I'm trying to remember exactly what your question was again, John. With that as a background, here was the punchline. I forget exactly what you asked.
Oh, just mainly the definition of faith in terms of this situation. Because I know that we can say, there's a faith that we know there's a God, but do we have faith that God will do the right thing? And through us following what He's called us to do.
Well, I think when we're looking at faith here, we're looking at it in its rudimentary biblical sense. That it is trusting, it is relying upon God and what has been revealed of God. And certainly Rahab, as we say within this context, is being faithful to Yahweh to the point that she understands who Yahweh is within this passage. Everyone would agree with that. So that she is exercising faith.
Yeah, because it just seems as though faith would also say, maybe God will provide another way out for them, even if she does say, I'm not going to lie.
Right, that is the answer. That's what position A says. That it was, God's will that the spies get back to Joshua, obviously is seen by the fact that they get back to Joshua. So if she had told the truth, God would have had some other way to protect them. Oh yeah, they're up on the roof. And then she stepped back and see how the Lord, just as they were trying to get up on the roof, how God, would not allow that to take place. So they're saying the lie at this point circumvented a greater action, a greater revelation of God's power in the situation. And we can never say yay or nay to that because she told a lie. I don't know whether God would have used some of the means to protect them or whether He would have allowed them. And I have a hard time. I know that theologians get around this with the old, permissive will of God. I just have to say the will of God, because He does have a plan and purpose He is working out. That, to me, the Bible incorporates the fallenness of man and therefore his sin within the outworking of God's perfect will. Perfect will doesn't mean perfect means. Right? So I know the perfect will and the permissive will of God. Again, some would, maybe even some on the faculty would dispute the fact that in the end everything is within the perfect will of God. There is no such thing as permissive will. It is the fact that certain sinful actions are incorporated within the perfect will of God, without then saying they're non-sinful because they're a part of the outworking of God's will. All right, Steve, and then let's break.
I was just wondering if we could just call it sin and say that sin was part of God's plan.
Well, that's where I'd end up. Mm-hmm. And whether it's a greater sin or less a sin, it's still sin. Mm-hmm. And that at the end of the day, I mean, I think biblically that is our answer. Biblically our answer is God is working out His plan and His purpose, and His plan and purpose incorporates as a means the sinful acts of man. And the greatness of God is once again seen in the fact that He is able to overcome the sinful actions of man. In fact, the very man who I'm shaking my fist, and I'm not going to do what you want me to do, in the end is doing exactly what God wills him to do for the furtherance of His perfect plan and purpose. And of course, you sit back like the Apostle Paul, who has dealt with the outworking of God's plan and purpose in light of the unfaithfulness of his people in Romans 9, 10, 11, and have to stand back and say, who can comprehend God's ways? And that's where I end up too. I read it, I understand it to a point, but say, whether you take position A or B, how can it be? I'm with Paul. Who can understand? Who can give counsel to the mind of God? I certainly can't. Because counsel means you understand more than the counselee. And I know at this point, I don't know more than the person I'm trying to counsel. So, yeah, sin, human sin from beginning to end of Scripture is part of the means that God incorporates with his plan and purpose. But that does not condone the means. It only shows us the greatness of God. And so, you're right, Steve, in the sense that, I usually have an answer to every theological conundrum, every exegetical point within Scripture. The sovereignty of God. God is in control. Because I think in the end, that is the biblical answer to when we don't know the answer. Well, the biblical answer when you don't know the answer is the same as when you do know the answer. The sovereignty of God. He's in control. And our responsibility as God's people is to wrestle with Scripture and to, yes, directed by the Spirit of God, to bring our lives in conformity to what God has revealed concerning Himself and ourselves within Scripture. That is our responsibility. And we leave the rest in God's hands. Joshua chapter 10, you should be aware of the discussion this entailed. And the great issue of where poetry begins and ends. And whether the whole passage is to be viewed in a figurative, or statement of Joshua is to be viewed in a figurative or in a literal fashion. We're taking a look at Joshua chapter 10, verses 12 to 14. Joshua spoke to Yahweh in the day when Yahweh delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, and here's Joshua's words, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, O moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. All right, is that still to be viewed as poetic? Because now the narrator is saying what Yahweh did in response to the words of Joshua. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Now, certainly, there could be a question in verse 12 when Joshua said, sun, stand still, moon, also stand still in the valley of Ajalon. At this point, that he was speaking in some kind of a figurative sense. That he's just basically saying, we need more time. And so God help us. God help us. Time in his sense that we need to complete a victory. And the idea within the ancient world that a victory is always completed in a single day. And he's basically using this figurative understanding to say, God, we need your help to bring us a victory. And those who take the figurative point of view like Howard would say that when the narrator comments at the end of verse 13, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, did not hasten to go down, that's exactly the way we understand it, that it's just a figurative statement by Joshua that, there was using the same kind of language, in some way God answering that. That has not been, as you can see, the predominant way in which the text is taken, because verse 13, the latter part of verse 13, definitely seems to be the narrator's comment. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky. And stopped means to have the idea that, using phenomenological language, where the sun was when Joshua uttered the words is where the sun stayed for a whole day. Now, is that a whole 24-hour period or a whole 12-hour period? Is it talking about day versus night, or daylight versus nighttime? And that could go either way. So I'm not going to be here to defend either a 12-hour stop or a 24-hour stop. But I do think from the text there was a stopping. Now, I don't know how God worked everything out within the universe to stop the sun. I've asked for time to stop many, many times, and God has never answered my prayer. All right, but he did in this situation, as Joshua speaks. And so it's interesting that, it's literal, but did the earth stop rotating? Was it the sun's light that lingered? Phenomenologically, that's what seems to be seen. Some say the sun's light was blocked. I have a hard time how the sun stopped and the light was just blocked. That doesn't seem to be what is being said here. Or some kind of special sign was involved that we don't particularly understand at this point. I would say there's good argument for position 4. God did something special that we don't understand today. But we understand the ramifications of what happened, and that is that God did elongate the time for Israel to pursue the enemies. And with Gibeon being to the east, the valley of the Ajalon to the west, even Joshua's words are understandable in a literal way, not just figuratively. Sun stands still at Gibeon. I can look back to the east and see the sun. I can look to the valley and see the moon. It's like the sun was just coming up and the moon was just descending. And this is a natural phenomenon that could be understood. And Josh would just basically say, Lord, hold it at this point until we are able to win the victory over the Canaanites. And the same God who throws the hailstones down from heaven upon the Canaanites is also the God who stopped the sun and implied the moon, at least for a 12-hour period, if not a 24-hour period, while Joshua is able to complete the conquest. And just taking it at face value, it seems that and the text doesn't explain how, other than this is miraculous, that God literally gave the additional time by stopping the sun for a period of time so that Israel could complete the task of putting to death, although more died by what the hailstones God sent them from the actions of Israel. And certainly, therefore, the narrator is right in verse 14. There was no day like that before it or after it when Yahweh listened to the voice of a man for Yahweh, for Israel. This is part of his fighting for Israel, is doing what man asked and listening to the voice of Joshua and, to use my own figurative statement, stopping the sun in its tracks for a lengthy time period of either 12 to 24 hours for this to take place. And the text itself says it's a unique day. There's never been a day like that before or after in this unique sense in human history. I have a hard time saying, well, all right, that's just figurative. That's a unique day. That's just figurative language. Seems as though it's a unique day. It's something unique about the day, which is to be literally understood. And I think the text, certainly within the narration at the end of verse 13 and 14, leads us to position A, which, as you can see, is the majority position among the commentators. Well, just a quick word about, and I just say one thing about preaching Joshua: preach the whole book. Let's move on to Judges. All right, all I mean by that is, I think we already made the statement, is we love Joshua 1 to 12. We love talking about victory. And then all of a sudden, chapters 13 to 21 become one broad message, having spent about 12, 13, 14, 15, 25 messages on Joshua 1 to 12. And if you don't believe me, take a look at all the popular expositions that are out there. Have all these messages on principles we can learn to have conquest in our service of God from the book of Joshua. Well, why don't we learn some principles from chapters 13 to 21 on how to continue to experience victory and learn the lesson from Israel that didn't always. Now, I know in those passages, we take Caleb because Caleb's preachable. But after that, we kind of gloss over the rest, and I look back over my notes on Joshua, and I try to do 25 messages on Joshua and do justice to every chapter within the book. And that is my encouragement as you preach Joshua. So don't just preach the good parts. Don't just emphasize the positive and avoid the negative within the narrative. Preach the whole text. So if you're going to begin Joshua, commit yourself to equal time to the passages within the book. Drew.
Just wondering, if we preach the whole of Leviticus, the whole of Joshua, the whole of every book we come to, how we, isn't there a sense in which at some point you've got to get through some stuff quicker in order to really be able to get to everything?
Well, narrative by its very sense, I would say, as I've already told you, is you never make a mistake by broadening it out, by taking a bigger picture approach as far as narrative is concerned. I mean, if you really want the challenge of Joshua, preach Joshua in one message, the whole thing. All right, or go back and do a 3-part series. Their conquest of the land and their distributing of the land, and then, what it's going to take to stay in the land. In other words, go broader, and the broader you are, I think the better you're able to communicate the big picture, to people. So And I know Dr. MacArthur always says that in preaching, less is more. Well, when it comes to narrative, I'm sure that more is not more, as far as preaching narrative is concerned. So I just use what I've already said in the past, and all I'm saying is yeah, if you speed it up, don't speed it up to the point you ignore what is there. We tend to concentrate upon what we like and to ignore what we don't like. But I would say this, all has been written, for our obviously teaching and correction, reproof, and training in righteousness. So look at it all. All right, on to Judges. 3 minutes. All right, well, we're going to go through Judges quickly on Friday, gentlemen. Let's just introduce it. All right, we don't have to worry about the title. It's the same in both the Hebrew and the Septuagint, based upon the major characters, humanly speaking, that are seen within the book. Yes, it's going to be an interpretive issue. We'll come back to it on Friday. But the date of events go from the death of Joshua. It came about after the death of Joshua. And then in verse 8, chapter 2, Joshua the son of Nun died at the age of 110. So that the event that begins what is seen in Judges is the death of Joshua. And then, of course, we know from Joshua, it's repeated here in Judges chapter 2, then the elders associated with him, they'll probably go another 10 to 15 years, we've already discussed. And then they pass off the scene. And it goes all the way to the last historical event recorded in the book, which is at the end of chapter 16, with the death of Samson. So historically, it's interesting, we go from death to death. From the death of Joshua to the death of Samson. Just as in the book of Joshua, we really go from the death of Moses to the death of Joshua and Eleazar and the elders associated with Joshua. And we've already talked about how the note of from death to death helps us appreciate what is in the former prophets. And also that we have the continuing impact of to this day, particularly 121. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Israel in Jerusalem to this day. And of course, we've already seen that echoing what is in Joshua chapter 15, verse 63. And of course, is preparing us narratively for what is going to be seen in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when David is going to conquer Jerusalem and make it his capital city. And again, to this day, with Jerusalem, reminds of what we've already said too, the importance of Jerusalem before Jerusalem became important in the narrative of the former prophets, when it became the place where the temple was established and the Davidic house ruled and governed Israel from. So already we see this importance upon Jerusalem, and as the author speaks about Jerusalem, its continuing impact, the Jebusites are still there to this day.
Since you mentioned Jerusalem, how did you figure in verse 1:8 after reading the 21, where it says the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire?
Mm-hmm. They did.
Which would seem to think that they've conquered it, everyone's gone, and then you have verse 21, but the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem.
Well, you got, and this gets to Jerusalem, the city, and the environs around it, being a part of Judah, being a part of Benjamin. That same thing now you've understood from Joshua. Okay, a military conquest took place, but then Benjamin did not follow up by taking its part of the territory and possessing it, which allowed the Jebusites to remain, and not only that, but to rebuild the city and control that citadel until David comes along. Okay? That's my understanding. A conquest, but then they didn't follow up on the conquest. That's exactly what we're seeing in Joshua.